Hello to all of you YouTube Bible students. Good to have you on board with us again today. Today we'll be studying a lesson that's going to come out of the book of Luke, Luke chapter 6, verse number 1 through 11. My name is Reverend Wayne Hubbard. I'm the pastor at Grace Temple Baptist Church in the city of Oakland, California. We're located at 6750 Foothill Boulevard in the city of Oakland, California. Our times that we come together for worship is on Sunday morning at 11 a.m. I sure would love to have you to come in on us and have worship service with us. Sure would love that. Now, as you watch this broadcast, those of you who have already signed in and you have already subscribed to it. I appreciate it. God bless you. Thank you so much. For those of you who haven't yet subscribed, I'm still praying for you. I want you to subscribe if you can, please. And as I usually state, that if you watch the broadcast and you enjoy it, I would like for you to give me a thumbs up. I certainly would appreciate that. Okay, let's get ready to go to the lesson. For those of you who didn't get it the first time, it's going to be coming from the Luke, the Gospel according to Luke, and it's going to come from chapter number 6, verses 1 through 11. The name of this lesson is going to be called Healing on the Sabbath Day. Healing on the Sabbath Day. I pray that you are all there. So let's get ready to get started. Oh, and by the way, I'll let you know that I'll be using the King James Version when I'm giving the scriptures for these 11 scriptures that I'll be using. King James Version, starting with Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. Now, Jesus used the Sabbath on the occasion for teaching, and every now and then he also taught with his actions, because this is, like I said, is about healing on the Sabbath, the way that it was worked up on the Sabbath. Those who came to observe Jesus, of course, they either came to him to learn or to criticize. And they found that the critics found that it was very difficult to argue with Jesus because Jesus always had a way of defeating them in their own arguments. There would seem that they weren't able to do anything about it. Now, as for the Sabbath day, only Jesus understood the Sabbath day properly and what it was all about. He was the only one that understood it well. And he left an enduring message and lesson for us even today concerning the Sabbath day. Healing on the Sabbath day, and I'm starting with verse number 1 at chapter 6. So bear with me. And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first day that he went through the cornfield. And his disciples plucked the ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them with their hands. Now we find Jesus in this case right here. He was in the city of Capernaum in Galilee. He was at a synagogue before he came through these cornfields. So he was at a synagogue, of course, on the Sabbath day. That's generally when the Jews met at the synagogue, was on the Sabbath day. On this Sabbath day, Jesus was passing through a field with grain, him and his disciples. And he and his disciples had already attended the services at the synagogue, so they were just leaving and they were walking in the afternoon or in the early evening. And of course, they would not have walked too far because according to the violations of the Sabbath day, they couldn't walk too far. They had to keep their distance very short. So it would have been a short walk coming from the synagogue to wherever they were going, and they were passing through a grain field. It says here in Luke chapter 6, verse 1, it says it was a cornfield. Elsewhere in the Bible, they would not have used the word corn. They would have used barley field or wheat field. That's what they would have described it as. The word corn in British English is a general word for grain. So it was just a general word for it. And not only that, but we saw certain things that they were doing that you couldn't do with corn. So it lets us know they're either dealing with wheat or barley. And we'll explain that. The husk around each seed of wheat or barley can be removed by rubbing them together with your two hands. That's how you would move the husk off of the seed. And the uncooked seeds were edible, and they were nutritious, and of course they were perfectly kosher. So therefore, these were just right. Now let's take a look at the next verse, verse number 2, and it says, "And a certain of the Pharisees said unto him, Why do ye that which is not lawful on the Sabbath day?" He saw the Pharisee who was following him, was more than one, was following him. Noticing that his disciples was going through the grain field, and they were picking corn or grain, of course, and they was preparing it to eat, rubbing it in their hands, and they were eating it. Well, they were accused of breaking the Sabbath laws, is what they were doing. A little bit of background about the Pharisees so we can kind of put it all together. The Pharisees were respected by the common people of that day. They were not really at all the governing religious authority. They weren't that at all. A lot of people think that the Pharisees had that kind of power. Actually, they did not. It was the ones who had the political power were the Sadducees, the chief priests. Now, they were the ones who had the political power in Judah. They ran the temple, and they dominated Jerusalem and all of the rest of Judea. Not the Pharisees. It was the Sadducees and the chief priests. The Pharisees were based out of Jerusalem, but they came to Galilee because they were interested in watching Jesus, following him. The Pharisees must have been following Jesus around and watching him because they want to evaluate him. They had been hearing so much about his teaching and about his miracles. They want to know who he was so they can take the information back to Jerusalem, whether he was a threat or whether he was a real teacher or whether he was just something else. They wanted to make notes of it and carry it back to their hometown. That what they was objecting to at this particular time, they was objecting to Jesus' disciples picking grain on the Sabbath day. This is what they accused Jesus of doing with his disciples. And without rebuking his disciples and saying, no, you cannot pick the grain on the Sabbath day. Jesus nor his disciples violated the basic laws of the Sabbath. They never did. They always kept the rules of the Sabbath during this particular time of Jesus' ministry. Jesus believed that the Pharisees interpreted the Sabbath rules wrong. Jesus saw that they were guessing what the requirements was of the Sabbath day, but they was definitely interpreting it wrong. This is one of the things that they was interpreting wrong, according to the way that the laws are written according to the Sabbath. It's okay if you're going to pick grain, but you cannot use any tools to harvest it. And whatever grain that you pick, you must eat it right away. You can't store it. You cannot get it ready for sale. You must eat what you pick right away, and you could not use any tools for it. That's the way the law is written. However, these Pharisees, they were just saying, just picking grain, even eating it. Or better yet, I think they were trying to be trickery. I believe they were testing Jesus to find out if he really knew the laws of the Sabbath. I believe that's what they were doing. And if they found out that Jesus was ignorant to the laws of the Sabbath, then they'll be able to trick him even further. Concerning the Sabbath laws, even for today's standard to us, the Sabbath was and still remains today a sign between God and the Jewish nation. That's what it is then, and that's what it is today, according to Exodus chapter 31, verse number 13. There is no evidence in the Bible that this same Sabbath were ever a requirement to Gentiles. It never was. According to Acts chapter 15, verses 19 to 20, non-Jewish Christians are not required to follow the laws of their Sabbath. So that takes care of that section right there. We are not under oath to the Hebrew Sabbath, coming from Exodus, as I stated earlier, 31. You can find this ruling also in Romans chapter 14, verses number 10, verse number 4 to 10. You can find the same thing that I just explained to you right there. So we are not bound to this, but these good study lessons are very good for us. Let's take a look at verse number 3 in our lesson and verse number 4. It says, "And Jesus answering them said, Have ye not heard so much as this, that David, when he within himself was hungered, and they which were with him was hungered too? How he went into the house of God, and did take and eat the showbread, and gave also to them that were with him what it is not lawful to eat, but for the priest alone." So what Jesus did with these Pharisees that should know the answer to this, what Jesus is saying to them, he gave them a little Bible lesson that they should have known the answer to. A little bit of history concerning David, when David was, at this time, David wasn't king when he did this, what Jesus referred to. He was actually a fugitive, is what he was. Him and his troops that was with him, they were running from King Saul at this time and all. So they accused Jesus of allowing his disciples to break the Sabbath laws by their interpretation. As I stated earlier, they weren't using any tools. They were using their hands, and they were eating what they was able to pick. So Jesus gave them a little lesson, is what he was letting them know. Imagine that. Here you have a country preacher from Galilee, way many miles away from Jerusalem, and he's given the Pharisees, who think they know everything, he's given them a Bible lesson that they are definitely wrong in understanding about. Imagine that. So Jesus asked them to ponder what we will find in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse number 6. It's about David receiving the sacred bread from the tabernacle, is what it was. Now, you see, this bread that was in the tabernacle was only, and it was on the Sabbath day. This bread that was in the tabernacle was replaced every Sabbath day, and it was only for the priest to eat. Only for the priest. No one else was to eat this showbread but the priest. And it was put there every Sabbath day for them and for them exclusively. It is consecrated bread in the tabernacle. It was there every Sabbath day for them, and it was to be only eaten by the priest. Nobody else was even supposed to go in there and touch it. It's what Jesus was reminding them of that. That's in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 to 9. Yet David and his men went into the tabernacle and grabbed that bread and ate it, and nothing negative happened to them. Why? Because they were hungry. That's the reason why. And the point is that the Sabbath is not made for people to starve about. It's made to help. It's made to bless. That's what it's supposed to be. And Jesus is letting them know that, letting the Pharisees know that. So this is what was happening to his disciples while they were in the grain field. They were being blessed with a meal, and that's the way they were doing. Yet David and his men ate this bread, and it was supposed to be only for the priests. Well, they were hungry at the time. Jesus was letting them know the Sabbath is not meant to torture anybody. It's meant to help people. Now, that's not the way that the Pharisees saw it. They decided to add their own little cut to it, you see. Let's take a look at the next verse right here, verse number 5. And he said unto them, that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. It's what Jesus was saying to these Pharisees. Now, they didn't understand a single word of that, what Jesus was saying. At this time, Jesus was 100 miles over their head for them to even know what he was talking about. But this is what Jesus meant by that. There were two prevailing interpretations concerning what Jesus meant when he said that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It is possible that both the two interpretations concerning what Jesus is saying here are correct. It's possible for it to be correct. The reason why it's possible, because a teacher of Jesus' high caliber can make profound statements that contain more than one truth at the same time. My goodness, he's the Word of God. So, of course, he can say things that we don't quite understand or might be over our heads, but this is what he do. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. The first interpretation of Son of Man is what Jesus is saying here. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Here he's referring to people in general. All of us, of course, were born from somebody. All of us was born from somebody. So this is how Jesus is coming with this right here. In this interpretation, Jesus would be saying that people are more important than the Sabbath. It's what he's saying. Also, Mark chapter 2, verse 27, say the same thing. People are more important than the Sabbath. When it comes down to a starving person or a person who needs to survive, should the Sabbath torture them? Jesus was letting them know that the Son of Man, or people, are over the Sabbath anyway. To fulfill human needs like hunger should not be interfered with by any interpretation what people think the Sabbath means. It's clearly what Jesus was saying. Now, the second interpretation, which fits the understanding that Jesus used the David account that we just talked about, Jesus was using that account, is that the Son of Man, when he say the Son of Man, here he's talking about himself. Now, if the Pharisees had heard that word Son of Man, the only place that is written in the Bible, in the Old Testament, they wouldn't have had access to the New Testament because it wasn't available for them at that time. The only place they would have heard the word Son of Man would be the closing of the book of Daniel. They wouldn't have understood that. But we understand that as Jesus himself, as the Son of Man. He is claiming he has a special authority to make rulings about what is permitted on the Sabbath day. He has all the authority to say, these are the rules of the Sabbath day that you don't understand. I am the one who knows every rule that you don't understand. He's letting them know that. This offended the Pharisees, offended them, and who viewed themselves as experts of the law. Who are you that you will come here out of this little ghetto town of Nazareth that nobody know where you came from, nobody even know who your father is, and who are you to come and tell us? We come from Jerusalem. We come from the elite people of the world, and here you coming to tell us about our laws. So they were fuming about what Jesus was telling them, that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Verse number 6 and 7, we're going to move on to another incident. It goes like this. And it came to pass also at another Sabbath. We're focusing on Sabbath days here. It came to pass at another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and he taught. Now, catch these words very carefully because they're going to mean a whole lot. That he of course is Jesus, entered into the synagogue and he was taught. He was teaching is what he was doing when he went into the synagogue. The only time you are allowed to handle a scroll and to teach from it is you had to get the okay from the chief of the synagogue. He would have to give you the okay to do this. There's something else that you need to know that I'm going to share with you. The way that it normally worked during the first century, the person who would be teaching that day in the synagogue, he would get a scroll. He wouldn't get a scroll. The keeper of the scrolls would bring the scroll to him. He would open the scroll, he would read it, and from what he read would be his message. He would give the scroll back to the keeper, and the keeper would put it away. After that, the scroll was put away, everybody was to sit on the ground. Even the one who was teaching They didn't have chairs. They sit on the ground. The teachers sit on the ground, and all the listeners in the synagogue sit on the floor. Now, that's going to come up later. We'll come back to that again. And he taught, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. You notice that just come up from nowhere? His right hand was withered. How would anybody know that? He's sitting down like all the other people in the synagogue, and it is noticed that a man with his right hand was withered. Is pretty much what it says right here. Or he was handicapped. Let's put it that way to make it easier to understand. Verse number 7 says this, and the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, the scribes, of course, are people who call themselves experts of the law. And they're there, and they're watching Jesus to find out what's he going to do. They had heard that he had been breaking Sabbath laws, and they wanted to be able to confirm it and, of course, cause everyone's attention to it. Let me finish looking at that. Verse number 7, and the scribes and the Pharisees watched him, not the man with the withered hand or the handicapped hand. They watched him. They watched Jesus. Why? They watched him whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they may find accusations against him. Now, I personally believe that the whole thing was a setup. And I'll tell you why I think it was a setup. I believe that the scribes and the Pharisees made sure that this handicapped man was in the synagogue in a place where Jesus could see him. And they could see the whole thing too. I believe that they set this whole thing up. I do believe that. Because they are looking for Jesus to heal this man on the Sabbath day. Now they'll be able to have witnesses, and they can, of course, escalate an accusation against him to get people not to believe him at all because he's breaking the Sabbath laws. Now, let's take a look at what's going on here. Now, this man, the man, of course, who had a handicapped hand, he was fully grown, and his hand had probably been disabled from birth. If we could look at it that way, there was nothing urgent about his condition. He was apparently not in any pain at all. He was able to sit comfortably there with him. His life was not in any danger. Some people might argue that Jesus should have waited until the day after the Sabbath. He should have waited till Sunday to heal this man. Some people would argue that. Why would you do it on the Sabbath day and cause this trouble? Why would you do that? Do it tomorrow. You'll find the man. So do it then. Of course, Jesus is not going to take any orders from the Pharisees and the scribes, especially if they're wrong and don't understand. Jesus observed the Sabbath according to the customs of his people. He did what the people did. With the customs of the people is what he did. All these extra amendments that was added to it coming from the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus didn't care about that. He didn't even listen to it. He let them know that you're twisting the scriptures is what you're doing. Jesus also oversees the Sabbath with intentions of doing what was good and what was right on the Sabbath. That's what it was supposed to be. For what is good and what is right. Not to torture people, not to lord over people, not to rule over people, but to especially do what is good and what is right on the Sabbath. After all, he did claim Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He did claim that. Most likely this happened in Galilee because the Pharisees were from Jerusalem. That was a long way south from where they were. They were just there to evaluate Jesus and to criticize him at that time. Let's take a look at verse number 8 and verse number 9. Do you have the scene? You see what we have here? We have Jesus' teaching. He has the attention of everyone in the synagogue. But it appears, and everybody, you can recognize the Pharisees and the scribes because they are dressed to the T. These guys are from the city, and they're wearing the finest clothes that can be worn, especially in Galilee. And they're all there together, and they all act like they know everything. And of course, in the middle of it all, we have this handicapped man with a withered hand. And it's quiet there. And as everybody's watching what's going on, verse number 8 and verse number 9, let's look at it. It says, but the he here is Jesus. But Jesus knew their thoughts. That means Jesus knew what they were thinking. What the scribes and the Pharisees was thinking. He was reading their mind before they were able to even come up with a thought. Jesus was ahead of them and knew what they was going to think and what they were thinking. And he said to the man, now Jesus is speaking to the handicapped man, which had the withered hand, rise up and stand. Stop right there. He told the man to rise up and stand. Why? The reason why is like I told you earlier. The way that they congregated in the synagogues in the first century is everybody sit down. So Jesus stood up and told the man with that withered hand to stand up. And so therefore, the only two people that were standing in the synagogue would have been Jesus and the handicapped man. Everybody else, according to laws and customs, would be sitting down. And Jesus did something that went against the laws and the customs. He stood up and he told the man with the withered hand to stand up. Now everybody can see Jesus and can see the man with the withered hand. Remember, Jesus read their minds. He knew what they were thinking. He told them to stand up, and he rose, and he stood, and it said, stood forth. That word forth, in that ending word in forth, in that eighth verse, said forth, meaning that the man, when he stood up, he came close to Jesus. It's what he did. He stood up and came close to Jesus. Verse number 9, Jesus gets deep. Let's go there. He says, then said Jesus to them. The them is the you-know-who's, the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, when he's talking to the them, he's looking at them in the face. It's when he's talking to them. Jesus looked in their face and he said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is what Jesus said. This is what he said to the scribes and the Pharisees. I'm going to ask you one question. It's what he's saying to them. Is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy life? Which is the right thing to do? Is what Jesus is saying to them. The gospel often shows how Jesus knowingly can know things supernaturally. When it came down to understanding the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus understood them better than they understood their own selves. He's able to read their thoughts according to John 16:30 and also John 21:17 and elsewhere in the scriptures. When the Son of Man became man, he did not relinquish his omniscience. He still had all knowledge. When he came here, he had all knowledge is what he did. At this particular point, I'm talking about doing his earthly ministry. He still had all knowledge. And doing his earthly ministry, all right? He took on the weakness and the limitations of fallen humanity. He took on that. Except for sin, Jesus did not sin. Not one moment of his earthly life. According to Hebrews chapter 2, verse number 17, and Hebrews chapter 4, verse number 15. Jesus knew the intent and the thoughts of the scribes and the Pharisees. He knew already before they opened their mouths. Matter of fact, he didn't even give them a chance to open their mouths and all. So Jesus asked the man with the withered hand to stand up, which is something else that's out of custom for the Hebrew people inside the synagogue. And while he was standing, Jesus asked a question. We're going to look deep into this question. His question was not about what was permitted and what was not permitted on the Sabbath day. Jesus didn't ask anything like that. It was something that penetrates the very heart of the will of God. He's speaking about good and evil. It was a question like that. Jesus placed two options before them, the scribes and the Pharisees. Two options that you have a choice from: to do good on the Sabbath day or to do evil. That was the simple question. Now, they couldn't answer the question, or should I say, they wouldn't answer the question. And every ear in the synagogue, we are quite sure, was focused towards the Jews, the Pharisees, and the scribe. How will they answer that question? They couldn't say to Jesus to do good on the Sabbath day, because that meant that they were, and they knew Jesus was about to heal this man. That was good. That meant that they would be agreeing with Jesus if they was to say to do good on the Sabbath day. And they couldn't say the other option, to do evil on the Sabbath day, because that would make them the bad people to do evil on the Sabbath. So I'm not saying that they couldn't answer it. They wouldn't answer the question at all. They probably looked at each other and wondered to themselves, don't answer it. Don't guess. It's a trap. Leave it alone. But as we look into it, the scribes and the Pharisees in the synagogue on that day, on that Sabbath day, they were doing evil. It's what they were doing. They didn't say that's what they were doing, but that's exactly what they were doing. They were doing evil on the Sabbath day. These people who supposed to love the Sabbath day and love it right and love the laws, they were evil on the Sabbath day. Verse number 10 and 11, as we get ready to close and with this lesson right here. And it says, and looking around upon them all, he said to the man, stretch forth thy hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored, whole as another. I like these little added things that's in these verses. They're there for a reason. Absolutely every word in the verse is there for a reason. Let's take this verse and put a magnifying glass up to it and see if we can find something that we may not have seen before. Verse number 10, and looking around. Who's looking around? Jesus is looking around the entire synagogue at everyone that is seated in it. And of course, he's already given the scribes and the Pharisees something to do. Come up with an answer to the question that Jesus gave them. So while they were sitting there puzzled, Jesus is surveying the entire synagogue. Is there anyone who believe like the Pharisees? Or is there anyone who believe what I'm about to do? Heal this man's hand and all. And this miracle took place. It took place. Who were the witnesses? Everyone who was inside the synagogue, they were witnesses of what happened. And yes, the scribes and the Pharisees, they saw it too. As we close with the 11th verse, and it says this, and they, who's the they? The scribes and the Pharisees, in this 11th verse, were filled with madness. The scripture word says madness right here is also translated to crazy. It meant that the scribes and the Pharisees lost their mind. They went crazy, is what they did. And it says, and commune one with another. And they kind of got in their little circle and they start talking to each other. We can't say this about what is right, and we can't say this about what is wrong. It seems that we are put on a spot that they and wonder what would they do about Jesus. Let's see something else here. Let's see something else here. Because something else here is showing up. and we're going to look at it. There are many things in this world that need to be restored. I say this because this man with the withered hand and all, Jesus restored his hand. What Jesus' ministry was is everything that the devil broke, Jesus always fixed it. Always. So this is his hand need to be restored. This is naturally the work of the devil. God didn't make man to be broken. The devil came in and threw his bit in there. And every time Jesus came across it, he fixed it. It's what he did. This world needs to be restored. The world is subject to God's curse because of humanity's sin. The world's at this case. And all of the creation groans because of it. Everything that's created, from the worm who crawls on the deepest part of the ocean to the largest planet that circles our sun. All of it is part of God's creation, and all of it groans according to Romans chapter 8, verse 20 and 22. Jesus came to do the work of God. It's what he did. To teach his disciples what God is doing and to save people within Israel and beyond the Jewish nation. He came for that also. 2 questions for them to consider is what Jesus asked the scribes and the Pharisees in the synagogue that day. 2 questions for you to consider. Number 1 question is, another one that pops up in mind is, how could Jesus have divine power and to heal unless he's doing the will of God on the Sabbath? Scribes and Pharisees, if Jesus is doing wrong, how can he work miracles in front of you? He's doing things that only God can do. Something must be right about him. And if something is right about him, that means something is wrong about us. This is something for them to consider. And number 2, something that they need to consider. How could people have any doubt about the authority of his teaching when such a miracle is like this is demonstrated before everybody's eyes? Even though his teaching is revolutionary according to what we see and what we understand, and we haven't been taught that, we don't understand what he means. But his teaching must be different. He must be coming from the mind of God as he's teaching. He never quotes from the philosophers on earth or the Grecians who think they know everything, or from us in Jerusalem who think we know. He never quotes us. He comes with something entirely new, something different. And for his miracles to work, he must be right. They didn't see it that way. They didn't see it. As we see it, this is the account of Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were untouched by that miracle. If you was there and you saw this miracle take place, most likely you would cover your mouth and you would say, did you see that? Did you see the miracle? Look at that man. His hand is straight. He's fine. He's putting both hands together and comparing them, and they are the same. Look at him. When we saw it happen, Jesus did that. He must be the Son of God. He must be. He must be right. But the scribes and the Pharisees, they didn't see it like that. They didn't see it like they were witnesses to a miracle that ain't never happened in Jerusalem during their lifetimes. But it happened in Galilee, in a little makeshift synagogue. It happened there. But they didn't see the miracle that way. They saw it, but they wouldn't accept it. The miracle just added anger to them. Made it matter. Is what it did. Made it matter. And Jesus' teaching was not only about the Sabbath. It was also about all the commandments of the will of God. It was not just about the Sabbath. It was about the commandments of God. And it always will be and always has been. But saints, as I stated earlier, you are not bound by that yoke. You're not, according to the New Testament scriptures. That's for the Christian believers. Amen. Amen. God bless you. I pray that you've learned something new, and I pray that you were fed spiritually. I'm looking forward to seeing you the next time. We have another lesson next time. It's called Jesus' Mighty Power. And we're going to find that in the book of Matthew, chapter 14, verse 22 to 36. So stay tuned in, and when we bring that particular lesson, I'll be looking for you. Anyway, God bless you. Thank you all for attending. Amen.